The eastern sky held no promise that morning. Grey light seeped through the wreckage of what had once been a village. Slobodka Lina, the maps called it. Though by May 1944 the name meant little more than a collection of shattered walls and collapsed roofs scattered across the churned earth. The front had moved through here like a slow blade, carving away everything recognizable, leaving only the skeletal remains of human habitation. The German Grenadier Regiment 196 occupied defensive positions along this sector of the Eastern Front, part of the broader network of trenches, strongpoints and observation posts that traced an irregular line across the territories of what had been Poland. The Soviet forces pressed from the east with grinding persistence. Every day brought mortar fire, probing attacks, the constant threat of a major offensive. The Germans held their ground not through strength had abandoned them months ago, but through desperation and the simple fact that retreat meant death just as surely as advance. In this landscape of mud and blood, certain soldiers found themselves suited to a particular kind of warfare. The sniper operated alone or in small teams, removed from the mass tactics of infantry assault. His weapon was not volume of fire, but precision. One bullet, one target. The telescopic sight compressed distance, brought the enemy into intimate proximity while maintaining the safety of separation. It was a strange kind of killing, clinical, patient, requiring nerves that could withstand hours of absolute stillness, followed by a single moment of controlled violence. I learned early that the telescopic sight revealed more than just enemy soldiers. Through that magnified circle of glass, you saw details no rifleman ever noticed. The way a man moved when he thought himself safe, the casual gesture of lighting a cigarette, the moment when training gave way to exhaustion and someone stood just a little too upright in a communication trench. 300 meters became intimate distance. You could read the texture of a uniform, see if someone wore an officer's insignia, note whether they carried maps or field glasses. The terrain around Slobodka Lena offered good fields of fire if you knew where to position yourself. Ruined buildings provided natural hides. A collapsed cellar wall created a firing aperture that looked like random destruction. The edge of a forest offered concealment in shadow. I spent hours studying the ground, memorizing every depression and rise, understanding how light moved across the landscape at different times of day. This was the real work of sniping, not the shooting, but the preparation, understanding the battlefield better than your enemy understood it. On the 8th of May, dawn arrived cold and damp. Ground mist clung to the low areas, thick enough to obscure movement, but thin enough that you could see shapes when they passed through it. I had moved into position before first light, crawling the last 100 meters to reach a spot I had identified the previous evening, a depression in the earth where the rubble of a demolished house offered both concealment and a clear line of sight toward the Russian trenches to the east. The Soviets were not careless, but even disciplined soldiers made mistakes. Routine bred complacency. Someone who had survived 3 months in the trenches began to believe they understood what was safe and what was dangerous. They learned to read the rhythms of artillery fire, to sense when an attack might come, to know which positions drew enemy attention. But the sniper disrupted those calculations. The sniper made everywhere dangerous. Through my scope, I watched the Russian positions come alive with morning activity. Soldiers moved in the covered approaches behind their front line. Smoke rose from cooking fires hidden in dugouts. For nearly an hour I simply observed, patient, letting my eyes adjust to the magnification, understanding the patterns of movement. A sniper who fired too quickly revealed his position without confirming his target. Better to wait, better to be certain. Movement in a section of trench caught my attention, a figure climbing, careless about exposure. The telescopic sight brought him into sharp focus, a soldier pulling himself up onto the trench parapet, probably to get a better view of our positions. The range was approximately 500 meters, not an impossible shot, but not simple either. Wind minimal. Temperature cool but stable. The target stood still for a moment, silhouetted against the pale sky. I settled into the rifle, controlling my breathing, letting the crosshairs find their natural point of aim on his center mass. The carabiner 98K with its telescopic sight had become an extension of my body after months of use. I knew the trigger pull, the recoil, the way the scope would lift and settle. Between heartbeats, in that moment of absolute stillness, I squeezed. The report cracked across the empty ground. Through the scope I saw the figure jerk backward and disappear. No drama, no cry. just there, then gone. I worked the bolts smoothly, chambering another round, keeping my position, waiting to see if anyone else would expose themselves investigating what happened. But the Russians had learned caution. The trench remained quiet. I did not move for another 20 minutes. A sniper who fired and immediately displaced might avoid counterfire, but a sniper who fired and remained absolutely still, giving the enemy nothing to target, often survived longer. The adrenaline gradually faded. My heart rate slowed. The landscape returned to its patient, waiting character. One enemy soldier, dead. The war continued unchanged. The German military maintained detailed records even as the war turned against them. Every confirmed sniper kill required witness verification, documentation of date and location, testimony from observers who could corroborate the claim. This wasn't bureaucratic pedantry, it was necessary. Snipers operated independently, often beyond direct supervision. Without verification, the system invited exaggeration or outright fabrication. Trust had to be earned through evidence. Lieutenant Walter, the battalion adjutant, signed off on my first claim. Witness statements from soldiers who had been observing the same sector confirmed the kill. The paperwork accumulated. Date, 8th of May 1944. Location, Slobodka Lina, Sector 5, Wreaked 196. Event, enemy soldier engaged at 500 meters, observed to fall after single shot. Witness, Lieutenant Walter, Battalion Adjutant. The claim was recorded, filed, added to the tally that the Army maintained for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract as the strategic situation deteriorated. 2 days later, the conditions changed. Rain had moved in, turning the ground into a slick morass of mud that made movement difficult and observation worse. Visibility dropped. The Russians took advantage of the weather to improve their positions, working in the cover of rain and low cloud to push their forward trenches closer to our lines. This tactical creeping pressure was constant. Wherever you didn't actively resist, the enemy advanced. On the 9th of May, orders came down to engage enemy mortar teams that had been harassing our positions. Soviet mortars were effective and deadly, dropping shells with precision onto communication trenches, supply routes, command posts, but mortar crews needed to expose themselves to operate their weapons. They needed to stand near the tube to load rounds, adjust elevation, observe impact. This made them vulnerable. I moved to a different position, one that offered angles toward the suspected mortar locations behind the Russian lines. The range was significant, close to 500 meters, and the rain made optics difficult. Moisture beaded on the lens. I had to wipe it repeatedly, trying to maintain a clear picture through the scope. Patience became even more critical in these conditions. Rushing led to missed shots, and missed shots revealed your position without accomplishing anything. The breakthrough came mid-morning when I spotted movement near a clump of trees, Russian soldiers moving deliberately, carrying something. Through the scope, I could make out the distinctive shape of a mortar tube. They were setting up a new firing position, probably expecting the rain and reduced visibility to protect them from observation. They were wrong. I waited until one soldier positioned himself directly beside the mortar, preparing to drop a round down the tube. The shot was complex, accounting for range, the arc of the bullet drop, the slight wind that gusted across the open ground. I compensated, adjusted, let the crosshairs settle on the figure's torso. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. The bullet flew true. The Russian fell. I saw him crumple beside the mortar tube. His comrades reacted instantly, dropping into cover, abandoning the position. Through the scope, I observed their confused scrambling, the search for the source of fire. I remained motionless, invisible among the rubble and shadow. They never located me. After several minutes, they abandoned the mortar entirely, retreating to safer positions. The weapon sat unused for the rest of the day. That evening, back in the relative safety of our rear positions, I cleaned the rifle meticulously. Rain and mud were the enemies of precision weapons. Every component had to be dried, oiled, checked for rust or damage. The telescopic sight required special care. The mounting had to remain absolutely secure, the optics perfectly aligned. A scope knocked even slightly off zero turned a precision instrument into an inaccurate liability. Other soldiers in the company treated snipers with a mixture of respect and unease. We occupied a strange position in the military hierarchy. Technically just another enlisted man, often just a Gefreiter, lance corporal with no command authority. But we operated with unusual independence, reported directly to battalion staff, received special equipment and privileges. We didn't stand guard rotations, we didn't participate in trench digging details. Our entire purpose was to kill enemy soldiers from concealment, and the army facilitated that purpose with resources it denied to ordinary riflemen. Some resented this. Others simply found snipers unsettling. There was something about the deliberate, calculated nature of sniper killing that differed from the chaos of infantry combat. A soldier in an assault fired frantically at movement and shapes, rarely knowing if his bullets found targets. A sniper watched a specific human being through magnification, studied him, waited for the perfect moment, and then ended his life with a single, precisely placed shot. The intimacy of it disturbed some people. The cold calculation required to be effective disturbed others. I didn't particularly care about these social dynamics. The work demanded total focus, and the work was all that mattered. The war had reached a stage where ideology meant less than survival. Germany was losing. Anyone with functioning perception could see this. The question was no longer victory, but how long we could hold the line. How many Soviet soldiers we could kill before being killed ourselves, whether anything we did made the slightest difference to the ultimate outcome. A sniper's contribution to this grinding attrition was measurable but limited. One enemy soldier dead per shot, perhaps 3 or 4 per day under good conditions, a dozen or 2 per month if you survived and the opportunities presented themselves. In a war where hundreds of thousands died in major offensives, these individual kills seemed insignificant. Yet the High Command clearly valued sniper operations. They maintained the programs, provided the training, allocated the specialized weapons and optics. Perhaps they understood that effect extended beyond body count. A single effective sniper could paralyze movement across an entire sector, force enemy troops to take exhausting precautions, create an atmosphere of fear that degraded combat effectiveness. The terrain around Slobodka Lena gradually became familiar territory, mapped in my mind with a precision that exceeded any official cartography. I knew which approaches offered concealment, which ruins provided good hides, where the Russian trenches ran, where their communication routes crossed open ground, where officers tended to position themselves for observation. This knowledge accumulated through patient observation, through studying the battlefield day after day, noting patterns and vulnerabilities. By mid-May, the weather had improved. Clear skies brought warmer temperatures but also better visibility, which cut both ways. I could see the enemy more clearly, but counter-snipers could locate me more easily. The Soviets had their own snipers, men and women trained in the same patient, lethal craft. Some were exceptional. They understood camouflage, patience, marksmanship. Dueling with an enemy sniper required different tactics than hunting ordinary soldiers. You couldn't rely on their mistakes because they rarely made obvious ones. You had to outthink them, anticipate their logic, position yourself where they wouldn't expect. On one particular morning I identified a Russian sniper working in my sector. The signs were subtle but recognizable. Soldiers in the opposing trenches moving with unusual caution, avoiding certain routes, clearly aware of a threat. Then I spotted the telltale glint of glass, sun reflecting off a telescopic sight lens, distance approximately 400 meters. He had positioned himself well, in rubble that provided excellent concealment, and covered several of our key movement routes. The problem, he was watching the same ground I needed to observe. We couldn't both operate effectively in this sector. One of us had to withdraw or die. The duel became a test of patience and nerve. I couldn't just shoot blindly at a suspected position. That would reveal myself without guaranteeing a hit. He faced the same calculation. So we both waited, watching, trying to catch the other, making a microscopic mistake. Hours passed. The sun climbed, shifted, changed the angles of light and shadow. My body ached from maintaining absolute stillness. Muscles cramped. Thirst became significant, but movement meant death. I had to outweight him, had to be more patient, more disciplined. This was the essence of sniper warfare stripped to its purest form. 2 men locked in a silent contest of will, each invisible to the other, each waiting for a single betraying moment. The break came late in the afternoon. He shifted position slightly, probably to relieve cramped muscles. Just a tiny movement, but enough that the telescopic sight caught light at a fractionally different angle. The reflection was my target. I couldn't see the man, could barely see the weapon, but I could see where the weapon was. I aimed for the center of that glint, and fired. The glass shattered. I saw it even at 400 meters. The sudden fragmentation of the lens, the scope destroyed. Whether I'd hit the sniper himself or just his optic, I couldn't confirm, but either way, he was neutralized. A sniper without an operational scope was just an ordinary rifleman, and an ordinary rifleman at 400 meters wasn't a threat. I remained in position for another hour, waiting to see if he'd re-emerge or if other snipers had been working with him. The position stayed abandoned. He'd either been killed or wounded or had withdrawn to get a replacement weapon. That evening I reported the engagement. The documentation was vaguer than usual. No confirmed body, just the destruction of enemy equipment and the suppression of enemy sniper activity in the sector. The command accepted this. They understood that not every engagement produced a corpse. Sometimes success meant denying the enemy freedom of action, forcing them to take precautions, making their operations more difficult and costly. The days blended together after a while. Each morning the same routine: move to a position before dawn, observe through first light, wait for targets, engage when opportunity presented, withdraw before enemy countermeasures could develop, return to relative safety, clean weapons, rest, repeat. The monotony was broken by moments of intense focus and violence, but those moments were brief. Most of a sniper's existence was waiting. The psychological toll accumulated in ways that were difficult to articulate. Killing at distance created a strange emotional disconnect. You saw your target clearly. Sometimes you could distinguish facial features through the magnification, but you felt nothing particular about them as individuals. They were objectives, problems to be solved with ballistics. The trigger pulled, the bullet flew, the target fell. Sometimes they died instantly. Sometimes they writhed, wounded, visible through the scope. You couldn't help them, even if you wanted to. They were enemies, and the war demanded their deaths. But late at night, in the darkness of a dugout, memory worked differently. Faces seen through telescopic sights returned unbidden. A young soldier lighting a cigarette, unaware he had seconds to live. An officer studying a map, planning movements he would never execute. A runner sprinting between positions, convinced he was moving too fast to be hit. All of them frozen in that final moment before the shot, preserved in memory with uncomfortable clarity. I didn't experience guilt exactly. Guilt required believing you had done something wrong, and I didn't believe that. I was a soldier following orders, fighting an enemy that was trying to kill me and everyone on my side. The moral complexities of the war's origins seemed abstract and irrelevant from a muddy trench on the Eastern Front. What mattered was survival. Each enemy soldier I killed was one who wouldn't kill my comrades. The arithmetic was simple, even if the emotions were complex. By early July, the front had shifted. Soviet pressure intensified across multiple sectors. Intelligence reported major offensive preparations. Reinforcements arrived on the Russian side. Fresh divisions, new equipment, increased artillery. The Germans scrambled to strengthen defenses, but resources were stretched impossibly thin. Every sector needed reinforcements. None received adequate support. On the 3rd of July, I was positioned along the Slobodka-Klobiekin road, a supply route that both sides contested. The Russians had been pushing patrols forward, testing our defensive strength, identifying weak points for future assault. My orders were simple: interdict enemy movement, kill anyone attempting to use the road, make transit so dangerous the Soviets would have to find alternate routes. The road itself ran through partially forested terrain, offering reasonable concealment for a sniper willing to position himself deep enough in the woodline. I found a suitable hide approximately 300 meters from the road in a thicket that provided both visual concealment and a clear shooting lane. Setting up required extreme care. Breaking branches created sound. Disturbing vegetation left visible traces. I moved like water, slowly, making no noise, leaving no obvious signs of my presence. The waiting began. Morning stretched into afternoon. Insects tormented me, mosquitoes, flies, crawling things that I couldn't swat without creating movement. Sweat soaked my uniform. The sun beat down on the forest. My position offered no shade, no relief. This was part of the work too, enduring physical discomfort with absolute patience, maintaining readiness even as your body screamed for relief. Late afternoon brought results. A group of Russian soldiers appeared on the road, 5 men moving in single file, carrying weapons and equipment. They were trying to move quickly while maintaining some tactical awareness, but they clearly considered the road relatively safe. That assessment was about to prove fatal. I selected my target, the lead soldier, who appeared to be an NCO based on how the others deferred to him. The shot was straightforward at this range. I aimed, exhaled slowly, let the crosshairs settle on his chest. The shot broke clean. He dropped instantly, hit centre mass. The others dove for cover, scrambling into the drainage ditches on either side of the road, shouting to each other. I worked the bolt and tracked a second soldier who had taken cover poorly, still partially visible. A second shot. He jerked and went still. The remaining 3 stayed hidden, probably calling for support, trying to locate where the fire was coming from. I gave them nothing. My position was well chosen. The muzzle blast and flash would have been difficult to pinpoint from their angle, and the forest offered dozens of potential hiding spots. They couldn't risk movement. I couldn't get clear shots at their covered positions. Stalemate. I waited them out. 20 minutes. 30. An hour. Eventually they attempted movement, probably under orders to withdraw. One soldier broke cover, sprinting toward better concealment. I tracked him, led slightly, fired. The bullet caught him mid-stride. He tumbled forward and didn't move. The final 2 stayed frozen after that. They had watched 3 comrades shot down trying to move. Fear held them in place. As dusk approached, I withdrew from my position. Moving at night offered better concealment, and I had achieved the day's objective. 3 Russian soldiers dead, 2 others effectively pinned down and traumatized. The road would be considered dangerous now. Soviet commanders would have to allocate resources to clearing potential sniper positions before using that route, slowing their supply operations, complicating their logistics. Back with my unit that evening, I reported the engagement. Battalion staff received the information with tired approval. 3 confirmed kills, credible witnesses from observation posts who had seen the Russians fall, the documentation accumulated, date, location, number of enemies engaged, tactical effect. The machinery of military record-keeping ground forward, even as the war's outcome became increasingly certain. The following days brought similar operations. The Soviets were preparing something major. That much was obvious from their increased activity. Reconnaissance patrols probed our lines. Artillery batteries registered on key positions. Supply columns moved forward under cover of darkness. The signs pointed toward an offensive, though when and where remained uncertain. Snipers became particularly valuable during this preparatory phase. Our ability to observe deep into enemy territory, to note patterns and movements that ordinary troops couldn't see, provided intelligence that helped build the larger tactical picture. I spent hours behind the scope, not shooting, but simply watching, mentally cataloguing what units were moving, what equipment they were bringing forward, where they seemed to be concentrating forces. The reports I provided merged with information from other sources, captured documents, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts. Military intelligence tried to assemble these fragments into coherent understanding, tried to predict where and when the blow would fall. The challenge was that the Eastern Front stretched for thousands of kilometers. The Soviets could mass forces anywhere along that vast expanse, and German intelligence had to guess correctly or face being overrun in unprepared sectors. On the 11th of July, I achieved what would later be recorded as my 4th confirmed kill in the operational area near Lunaschneise, a forest sector north of the main defensive line. The Russians had been working forward through the woods, advancing slowly, using the thick vegetation for concealment. Our positions risked being bypassed if they weren't stopped. I positioned myself in a tree, climbing into the branches to gain both elevation and a different angle than snipers usually used. Most soldiers expected ground-level threats. Attacking from above created confusion and made source identification more difficult. The tree's trunk was thick enough to offer some protection, the branches dense enough to hide my outline if I positioned myself carefully. Through gaps in the foliage I could see the Russian advance. They moved cautiously, but not cautiously enough. One soldier emerged into a small clearing, perhaps 20 meters across, pausing to orient himself. The range was approximately 400 meters. The angle was sharp. I was firing downward at maybe 30 degrees. This affected the bullet trajectory in ways that required instinctive compensation more than calculated adjustment. I took the shot. Through the scope, I saw him fall, saw the other Russians scatter and take cover. They started shooting back, but not at my position. They were firing at ground-level positions in the direction the shot had come from. The fact that I was elevated and firing down never occurred to them. I remained motionless in the tree, watching their confusion, waiting to see if another target would present itself. Eventually they withdrew, dragging their wounded or dead comrade with them. I climbed down from the tree carefully, aware that a fall could be just as fatal as enemy fire. Back on the ground, I moved through the forest quietly, relocating to a completely different sector before the Russians could organize a proper search. The summer brought not only tactical challenges but physical ones. The heat was oppressive, water became a critical concern, a sniper in position couldn't simply stand up and go find a canteen. You carried what you needed for the entire day's operation, and if you miscalculated, you suffered. Dehydration affected concentration, steadiness, decision-making. I learned to drink heavily before moving to a position, to carry extra water even though the weight was burdensome, to ration carefully throughout the long hours of observation. The landscape itself changed with the seasons. The lush summer vegetation that had provided concealment in July began withering by late summer. Fields that had been green turned brown. Trees started losing leaves. Concealment became harder. Simultaneously, the Russian pressure increased. By September, the anticipated offensive finally materialized, a massive Soviet assault that crashed into the German lines with overwhelming force. During major offensives, the sniper's role shifted. Individual hunting gave way to defensive support. I found myself positioned in sectors where Russian infantry would likely attack, tasked with killing officers and leaders to disrupt command and control. The targets came in waves now, not isolated individuals but masses of soldiers advancing under artillery cover. The chaos of these engagements was different from the patient stalking that had characterized earlier operations. You didn't have time to confirm every target, to wait for the perfect shot. You fired at anything identifiable as leadership. Officers, radio men, soldiers carrying maps or binoculars. The goal was maximum disruption, create confusion in the attacking force, make them hesitate, force them to reorganize under fire. On one particular day, September 1st, according to the records, though the days had begun to blur together, I was supporting defensive operations in the Lemberg area. Our forces were conducting a fighting retreat, trying to extract from positions before being encircled. The Russians pursued aggressively, bringing up infantry and armor, pressing us constantly. I had positioned myself in a barn that offered good fields of fire toward the approaching Soviet forces. The structure was already damaged from previous fighting, which made it look less likely to be occupied. Through the broken walls, I had excellent visibility across the open approaches to our positions. The Russians came forward in textbook assault formation, infantry advancing in waves, using terrain for cover, suppressing suspected defensive positions with heavy weapons. Through my scope, I identified a figure who appeared to be coordinating the assault, a soldier who kept moving between groups, gesturing, apparently giving orders. Officer or senior NCO, high-value target. The range was significant, close to 300 meters, and he kept moving, never staying still long enough for an easy shot. I tracked him patiently, waiting for him to pause, to commit to a position even briefly. The moment came when he crouched behind a low wall, apparently observing our lines to plan the next phase of the assault. I had perhaps 2 seconds before he'd move again. The shot was instinctive at this point, years of practice compressed into automatic execution. Aim, breathe, press. The rifle kicked. Through the scope, I saw him collapse behind the wall. His subordinates immediately reacted, the assault losing coordination as they tried to figure out what had happened to their leader. The attack didn't stop. The Soviets had too much momentum and too many men, but it became more disorganized, less effective. I fired several more times that day, engaging targets of opportunity as they presented themselves. By late afternoon, ammunition was running low and our forces were withdrawing to new positions. I displaced with them, moving carefully through the chaos of a fighting retreat, trying not to become separated from friendly forces in the confusion. That evening, exhausted and filthy, I learned that my tally had crossed 100 confirmed kills. The number felt arbitrary. Each kill was just another day's work, another target engaged and neutralized. But the military valued these statistics, used them to identify effective snipers, to justify the resources allocated to sniper programs. So the count continued, documented with bureaucratic precision, even as the Reich crumbled. The autumn rains came, turning the landscape into a morass of mud that made everything harder. Movement slowed to a crawl, vehicles bogged down, supply lines became uncertain. The mud got into everything: weapons, clothing, equipment. Keeping a rifle operational required constant maintenance. The telescopic sight had to be protected from moisture, cleaned obsessively, checked repeatedly for alignment problems caused by the jarring of movement through rough terrain. By October, the defensive situation had deteriorated further. The Soviets drove forward relentlessly, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for territorial gains. The German forces bent but didn't break, conducting an organized retreat that traded space for time, trying to establish new defensive lines that could hold against the next offensive. I found myself operating in sectors that changed every few days as we withdrew. Learn the terrain, identify good positions, use them for perhaps 48 hours, then abandon them and move to a new sector. The constant displacement was exhausting. The accumulated fatigue of months of combat operations wore down even the most resilient soldiers. Men developed the 1,000-yard stare, that expression of emotional exhaustion that came from witnessing too much death for too long. On the 29th of October, I was positioned near Kruzlova in a defensive sector that intelligence indicated would face assault within the next day or two. The goal was to observe Soviet preparations and interdict high-value targets as they prepared their attack. The position offered excellent observation. I could see their forward assembly areas, could watch as they brought up supplies and positioned assault forces. Through my scope, I observed a Russian machine gun crew setting up their weapon in a position that would dominate one of our key approach routes. The crew worked efficiently, clearly experienced. They were establishing the gun in a spot that would inflict significant casualties on any German forces trying to move through that sector. The range was challenging, approximately 300 meters, and the crew stayed mostly behind cover, exposing themselves only briefly as they worked. I waited for the right moment. The gunner eventually positioned himself behind the weapon, adjusting the mount, getting ready to test fire. He was partially exposed, enough for a shot. If I executed perfectly, I fired. The gunner jerked and fell away from the weapon. His crew reacted instantly, dragging him into cover, abandoning the machine gun. Whether he was dead or wounded I couldn't confirm, but the weapon sat unmanned for the rest of the day, one less threat to our defensive positions. That night the Soviets probed our lines with reconnaissance patrols, testing our strength, trying to identify weak points. The darkness made sniper operations nearly impossible, but I remained alert, listening to the sounds of movement in the night, the occasional burst of gunfire as sentries engaged suspected infiltrators, the constant background noise of artillery in the distance. The next day, October 30th, brought clearer weather and renewed Soviet activity. They were massing for assault, that much was obvious. Artillery preparation began at dawn, a rolling barrage that walked across our positions, searching for defensive strongpoints to suppress. The bombardment went on for hours, the earth shaking with impact after impact, the air filled with smoke and dust and the smell of high explosive. When the barrage lifted, the infantry came forward. Waves of Soviet soldiers advanced under cover of smoke and suppressing fire from heavy weapons. This wasn't an environment where precision sniping could accomplish much. The target-rich environment actually made individual shots less impactful. But I engaged anyway, firing at any identifiable leader or threat, trying to degrade their assault effectiveness even marginally. By midday our positions were being overrun. The order came to withdraw to secondary defensive lines. The retreat was conducted under fire, soldiers moving in small groups, trying to break contact while maintaining some organizational coherence. I displaced with my unit, carrying the rifle and essential equipment, abandoning anything non-critical. During the withdrawal, I took a shot at a Russian officer who had advanced close to our positions, perhaps 70 meters away. The range was almost point blank for a scoped rifle. He went down cleanly. No time to confirm the kill. I had to keep moving, keep putting distance between myself and the advancing Soviet forces. By early November, we had established new positions, though calling them established was generous. Hasty fieldworks, minimal fortification, inadequate supplies. The defensive line existed more as a concept than as a physical barrier. But we occupied it anyway because falling back further meant abandoning more territory, and the High Command still clung to the illusion that every meter of ground mattered. The 5th of November brought another engagement, another few names added to the ledger of the dead. I was positioned in a wooded area, observing Russian movements as they consolidated their recent gains. Through the scope, I identified 2 soldiers who appeared to be officers. They carried themselves differently, moved with authority, were clearly directing other troops. The first shot dropped one of them at approximately 250 meters. His companion reacted instantly, dropping into cover, making himself difficult to target. I waited, patient, knowing he would eventually need to move or expose himself to maintain command of his unit. Sure enough, after several minutes, he shifted position to observe our lines. The second shot caught him as he raised binoculars to his eyes. 2 enemy officers dead in less than 10 minutes. The tactical impact was immediate. The Russian troops in that sector became noticeably less organized, their movements more hesitant. Without clear leadership, soldiers defaulted to caution, which meant slower advances, less aggressive probing. Every delay, every moment of hesitation bought time for our forces to improve defensive positions. The documentation of these kills followed the usual process. Battalion staff collected witness statements, confirmed the tactical situation, recorded the claims. The administrative machinery continued functioning even as the military situation collapsed. Perhaps maintaining records gave some sense of order to the chaos, some illusion that we were still a professional military force operating according to doctrine rather than a desperate collection of survivors trying to delay the inevitable. By mid-November, the cold had arrived. Winter on the Eastern Front brought its own specific miseries. The cold affected weapons, causing lubricants to freeze, making metal painful to touch with bare skin. The cold affected the body, draining energy, making hands shake, reducing the fine motor control necessary for precision shooting. The cold affected your mind, making concentration difficult, thoughts sluggish. I adapted as all Eastern Front veterans adapted, layers of clothing, improvised insulation, constant movement to maintain circulation when not in shooting positions. The rifle had to be kept from freezing, which meant bringing it into shelter whenever possible, using body heat to warm the metal before operations. The telescopic sight lens fogged from breath condensation, requiring careful wiping and warm-up procedures. On the 16th of November, I was operating near Yastrebiec, in a sector that had seen heavy fighting. The landscape was devastated. Shattered forests, cratered fields, the frozen corpses of soldiers who had died in earlier engagements protruding from shallow snow cover. The grimness was total, the war stripped of any remaining illusions. I had positioned myself in the ruins of a farmhouse, using the structural rubble for concealment. Through the broken walls, I had clear observation toward Russian positions about 300 meters distant. They were working on improving their defenses, bringing up supplies, rotating fresh troops to the front line. A target presented itself, an officer moving between positions, apparently inspecting the defensive works. The telescopic sight brought him into focus. He seemed young, confident, moving with the assumption of relative safety in an area well behind the immediate front line. That assumption was incorrect. The shot was technically straightforward, but emotionally complex. This wasn't reactive combat, wasn't self-defense in any immediate sense. This was calculated killing, watching a human being through magnification and consciously deciding to end his life. The trigger pull was smooth, practiced. He fell. The world continued. The war demanded nothing more complex than the mechanics of his death. I remained in position for several more hours, observing, waiting for additional targets. The Russians became more cautious after the shooting, moving with greater care, using cover more effectively. One death had propagated fear through an entire sector. This was the strategic value of sniping distilled to its essence, creating an environment where every open space became dangerous, where every movement required calculation, where fear degraded operational effectiveness. By late afternoon, I withdrew from the position, moving carefully through the frozen landscape. The cold had become brutal, well below freezing, wind cutting through any inadequate clothing. My feet were numb, despite layers of socks and improvised insulation. Frostbite was a constant threat, as dangerous as enemy fire in these conditions. That evening, warming myself near a small fire in a dugout shelter, I cleaned the rifle meticulously. The cold had left frost on the metal. The scope needed careful checking for any moisture that might have penetrated the housing. Maintenance was never ending, the only way to ensure the weapon would function when needed. The 19th of November brought one of the stranger engagements of the war. I was positioned in a sector near Przybora when I observed a Russian soldier behaving oddly. He was moving alone, apparently disoriented, possibly wounded or separated from his unit. Through the scope, I could see him clearly, young, stumbling through the frozen landscape, clearly in distress. The tactical calculus was simple. An enemy soldier in your sector of fire was a legitimate target. But something about the situation felt wrong. He posed no immediate threat. He appeared to be dying already from exposure or wounds. Shooting him felt less like combat and more like execution. I watched him for perhaps 15 minutes, tracking his movements through the scope, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. The training said, shoot. The military necessity said, shoot. The simple arithmetic of war said one more dead enemy was tactically beneficial, but some residual humanity made me hesitate. Eventually he collapsed in the snow and didn't rise. I maintained observation for another 20 minutes, confirming he wasn't moving. Whether he froze to death or succumbed to wounds, I never learned. I didn't fire. The decision wasn't based on mercy. Mercy was a luxury the Eastern Front didn't afford. It was based on the realization that shooting a dying man accomplished nothing tactically significant and would have revealed my position for no gain. I never reported that engagement. It didn't fit the documentation requirements. No confirmed kill, no tactical effect. Just a Russian soldier who wandered into my sector and died from causes unrelated to my actions. But the memory stayed with me more vividly than dozens of actual kills, perhaps because it represented a choice rather than an automatic tactical response. The following week brought more conventional operations. The Soviets continued their relentless pressure, attacking across multiple sectors, forcing withdrawals, grinding down the German defensive capabilities through sheer weight of numbers and material. We killed them in hundreds, in thousands, and still they came forward. The mathematics of the Eastern Front had become brutal and simple. The Soviets could sustain casualties that would have destroyed the German army 10 times over. By late November, I had achieved recognition as a particularly effective sniper. The High Command sent commendations, medals, official acknowledgements of kills that had crossed 120 verified eliminations. These accolades felt hollow. The medals didn't stop the Soviet advance. The recognition didn't change the strategic situation, but the military bureaucracy continued its rituals, maintaining the forms and procedures as though they mattered. On one occasion, a senior officer visited the battalion to observe sniper operations firsthand. He wanted to understand the tactics, the equipment, the methods that were producing documented results. I demonstrated positioning, camouflage, shooting techniques. He asked questions about training, about selection criteria, about how the army could produce more effective snipers. I answered politely, wondering what difference it would make. More snipers wouldn't change the outcome of the war, just increase the body count on both sides. But orders were orders, and the expectation was that I would continue operating, continue killing, continue filing the paperwork that documented each death. So that's what I did, morning after morning, taking position before dawn, watching the battlefield come alive with first light, searching for targets, executing the shots, maintaining the machinery of death with professional efficiency. The psychological toll had become impossible to ignore by this point. Sleep was difficult. Dreams brought images of faces seen through telescopic sights, moments frozen before death, the intimate knowledge of men I had killed without ever speaking to them. During waking hours, I could maintain the professional detachment necessary to function, but sleep stripped away those defenses, left me vulnerable to memory and imagination. Other soldiers noticed, though few commented. The 1,000-yard stare had become common enough that nobody found it remarkable. We were all damaged in various ways, carrying psychological wounds that wouldn't manifest fully until after the war ended, if we survived long enough to see the war end. December brought deeper cold and darker despair. The defensive situation continued deteriorating. Soviet forces drove forward across multiple sectors. German units conducted fighting withdrawals, trading casualties for time, trying to avoid encirclement. The broader strategic picture was clear to anyone paying attention. The war was lost. The only question was how long the dying would continue. On December 9th, I engaged Russian forces advancing through a wooded area near Zebek. The terrain was difficult, thick vegetation even after leaf fall, uneven ground, limited fields of fire. But the Russians had to use the available approaches, and I knew where those approaches led. I positioned myself early before dawn, getting into location while darkness still provided concealment. The position was uncomfortable. A shallow depression in frozen ground, minimal cover, but good visibility toward likely avenues of enemy approach. I settled in, wrapped in a white camouflage sheet that helped break up my outline against the snow, and waited. The Russians came forward cautiously. They knew the sector was defended, knew German forces had been falling back through this area, knew to expect resistance, but they couldn't see me. The camouflage was effective, and I had positioned myself in a location just off the most obvious firing points, a spot that they wouldn't automatically identify as a sniper hide. Through the scope, I identified a target, a soldier moving forward in what appeared to be a leadership role, gesturing to others, clearly directing their movement. The range was approximately 300 meters. I settled the crosshairs, controlled my breathing despite the cold, and fired. He went down. The others scattered, taking cover, suddenly aware that someone was watching them kill them. I worked the bolts smoothly, chambered another round, tracked a second soldier who had taken cover poorly. The second shot caught him as he tried to relocate to better concealment. 2 down. The Russians started firing back, but their shots were unguided. They knew generally where I might be, but couldn't pinpoint my exact location. Bullets snapped through the air above me, impacted the ground nearby, but nothing came close enough to be immediately threatening. I stayed motionless, giving them nothing to refine their aim. After several minutes, the firing slackened. They were conserving ammunition, staying in cover, waiting for me to reveal myself through movement. I gave them nothing. The stalemate continued for nearly an hour. Them pinned down, me unable to get clean shots at their covered positions. Eventually, they attempted to maneuver around my position, sending troops through the woods to flank me. I heard them moving, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the snap of branches. Time to withdraw. I backed out of my position slowly, using terrain for concealment, putting distance between myself and the enemy before they could complete their encirclement. By mid-afternoon, I had relocated to a completely different sector, kilometers away, in position to interdict a different Russian approach route. The war didn't pause for a single engagement's conclusion. There were always more targets, more sectors to cover, more enemies to kill. The 16th of December brought one of my last documented kills of 1944. I was observing Russian positions near Kharkov when I spotted a soldier behaving suspiciously. He was moving along a trench line, pausing to observe our positions, appearing to make notes or sketches. Intelligence gathering, probably. The range was about 250 meters, well within the effective range of the rifle. I took the shot. Clean hit. He dropped into the trench, out of sight. Whether he was dead or merely wounded I couldn't confirm from my position, but he was definitely neutralized. His intelligence mission was terminated. Whatever information he had gathered wouldn't be reported if he had died before passing it on. That same day I engaged another target, an artillery spotter who had positioned himself to direct fire onto our positions. The shot was longer, nearly 300 meters, and he was partially concealed behind rubble. I had to wait for him to expose himself enough for a reliable shot. When the moment came, I took it. He fell backward, his equipment scattering. 2 kills in one day, both tactically significant, 1 intelligence gatherer, 1 fire support coordinator. The impact extended beyond the individuals themselves. The Russians would now need to replace those specialists, would have to be more cautious about how they positioned observers and intelligence personnel. Every such complication slowed their operations, made their attacks less efficient. By late December, the war had reached a state of exhausted stalemate in our sector. The Soviets had advanced as far as their logistics could support. The Germans had withdrawn to positions that could be defended with available forces. Both sides dug in, fortified, prepared for the next phase of operations that would inevitably come with the new year. Christmas 1944 was a grim affair. No celebration, just survival. The cold was brutal, well below zero, the wind cutting through any inadequate shelter. We huddled in dugouts and ruined buildings, burning whatever we could find for heat, rationing the meagre supplies that still made it forward to our positions. I spent Christmas Eve in a defensive position, watching no man's land through the scope, searching for any sign of enemy movement. The landscape was frozen, desolate, the snow stained with the residue of countless artillery strikes. Here and there, the shapes of corpses protruded from drifts, soldiers who had fallen weeks or months ago, left unburied because retrieving bodies was too dangerous. On December 27th, I was positioned near Yastrzębiec when I observed Russian forces attempting to improve their positions under cover of twilight. They were building up a bunker, carrying materials, clearly trying to establish a more permanent strongpoint. The range was significant, approximately 300 meters, and the light was fading, making observation difficult. Through the scope, I identified a soldier who appeared to be directing the construction. Without leadership, the work would likely continue but less efficiently. I aimed carefully, compensating for the reduced visibility, and fired. The figure dropped. The construction work paused as soldiers scrambled for cover. I fired twice more, not at specific individuals, but at the general area where they had taken cover, discouraging them from resuming work. By the time I withdrew from position, darkness had fallen completely. The bunker construction had stopped. Whether they would resume in the morning was uncertain, but at minimum I had delayed their defensive improvements by a day, forced them to work under increased caution, demonstrated that the area was under observation. The year ended in cold and darkness. December 30th brought another engagement, a Russian patrol moving through the orchard near a command post. I engaged from concealment, dropping one soldier at approximately 300 meters. The others scattered. I relocated before they could organize a response. December 30th also brought final confirmation of my tally for 1944. 150 confirmed kills. The number seemed unreal. 150 human beings, each one seen clearly through telescopic magnification in the moment before death, each one a son or brother or father whose life I had ended from distance with a single precisely placed bullet. The documentation was complete, filed away in military archives that probably no longer existed, records maintained by a bureaucracy that was collapsing along with the regime it served. But the forms had been filled out, the witnesses had signed, the commanders had acknowledged, 150 enemies eliminated, the mathematics of death precisely calculated and recorded. The new year brought no renewal, no hope, just continuation of the grinding attrition. January 1945 opened with temperatures that dropped even further into brutal cold. The landscape was entombed in ice and snow, movement became difficult, vehicles froze, supply lines broke down, soldiers died from exposure as readily as from enemy action. On January 3rd, I was positioned near Przybora, observing Russian movements in an orchard area where they had established positions. Through the scope, I watched them going about their routines. Soldiers rotating guard duties, officers moving between positions, the daily administration of military life continuing even in the frozen wasteland. A target appeared, a dispatch runner moving from the bunkers toward the command post. He was sprinting, probably carrying messages that needed rapid delivery. The range was approximately 550 meters, a challenging shot made more difficult by his speed. I led him, tracking his movement, calculating where he would be when the bullet arrived. The shot broke. Through the scope, I saw him stumble and fall. The same day I observed and eliminated 3 more targets. Russian soldiers who exposed themselves during routine activities, each one a tactical opportunity that I exploited with professional efficiency. By day's end, the area had become notably quieter. The Russians had learned that movement in this sector drew lethal attention, and they were taking appropriate precautions. On January 5th, our artillery bombarded Russian trenches in the orchard. I was observing from a nearby position, watching for targets fleeing the bombardment. When the barrage lifted, I engaged a Russian who emerged from cover. Single shot at approximately 500 meters. He went down. Later that day, I engaged and killed another Russian soldier from the same position. 2 more names added to the tally. The 5th also brought sustained artillery fire on the bunkers. During the bombardment, I observed a Russian leave cover, probably attempting to reach better shelter. I shot him from 350 meters. Another kill, another statistic, another documented death. The pattern continued day after day. January 6th, 2 more Russians killed, one at 350 meters as he attempted to cross open ground, another at similar range as he operated near bunker positions. The documentation accumulated. Each kill verified, witnessed, recorded. On January 7th, I watched Russians approaching from an orchard, attempting to close distance with our positions. I engaged a sentry first, then a runner sprinting between positions. 2 shots, 2 kills. The approach was disrupted. The Russians took cover and didn't resume their movement for hours. The 9th of January brought engagement with a larger Russian force. They were attempting to move through an orchard toward our positions, clearly preparing for some kind of assault or major probe. I was positioned to observe and interdict their movement. Over the course of several hours, I engaged multiple targets, soldiers moving supplies, officers directing positioning, anyone who exposed themselves enough for a shot. By late afternoon, I had killed 6 Russians in that sector. The advance had stalled. The force that had been moving with purpose and organization had become cautious and scattered, taking cover, unwilling to expose themselves to the sniper fire that was picking them apart, piece by piece. The psychological impact of sniper operations was perhaps more significant than the tactical effect. Each sudden death from an unseen shooter spread fear through enemy ranks. Soldiers became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, reluctant to move even when movement was tactically necessary. This degradation of morale and operational effectiveness multiplied the sniper's impact beyond the simple arithmetic of bodies killed. But the cost to the sniper himself was also significant. Each kill required looking through the scope, seeing a human being in detail, making the conscious decision to end that life, watching the impact of the bullet, confirming the death. There was no psychological distance, no abstraction. The killing was intimate, even across hundreds of meters of separation. By mid-January, I had become something of a specialist in this grim work. The battalion relied on me for specific types of missions, interdicting command personnel, disrupting enemy operations in key sectors, creating zones of suppressive fire through the threat of precision killing. I executed these missions with professional competence, maintaining the equipment, filing the reports, adding to the tally of the dead. The war ground forward into late January. The strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The Soviets prepared for renewed offensives. German forces tried to consolidate defensive positions with inadequate resources and exhausted troops. The end was approaching, visible to anyone willing to see it, but the fighting continued because stopping required decisions that the High Command refused to make. On January 13th, I was operating near Jastrzębiec when the Russians launched a major assault. The bombardment was intense, hours of artillery fire that devastated our positions. When the shelling lifted, Soviet infantry came forward in waves, supported by armor, covered by smoke. I engaged targets as they presented themselves, focusing on officers and leaders, trying to disrupt command and control. The chaos was total, shells exploding, machine guns firing, soldiers shouting, the continuous roar of combat. Through the scope, I identified and killed a Russian officer directing assault troops, then another, then a radio man coordinating fire support. The assault eventually overran our positions. We withdrew under fire, conducting a fighting retreat through the ruined landscape. I displaced with my unit, carrying the rifle and essential equipment, abandoning the position that I had occupied for days. The Russian advance continued. We established new defensive lines kilometers to the rear. By late January, the exhaustion had become total. Months of continuous combat operations with minimal rest, inadequate food, constant stress had pushed everyone to the edge of human endurance. Soldiers moved like automatons, executing orders through sheer force of habit, too tired to feel fear or hope or anything beyond the immediate need to survive the next few hours. I continued operating because stopping wasn't an option. Each morning I took position, observed the battlefield, searched for targets, executed the shots that command expected. Each evening I withdrew, cleaned the rifle, rested as much as conditions allowed, prepared for the next day's operations. The tally continued to grow. 151, 152, each number representing a specific death, a specific moment when I looked through the scope and made the decision to pull the trigger. The faces blurred together after a while, individual kills, becoming indistinguishable from the mass of killing that characterized the Eastern Front. The final entry in my records for this period came on January 30th. I was positioned near Jastrzębiec, observing Russian forward positions. A soldier emerged from cover, moving along a trench line. Through the scope I could see him clearly. Young, probably a replacement recently arrived at the front. He moved with a combination of fear and inexperience that characterized new soldiers. I aimed, breathed, fired. He fell. The war continued. Another life ended. Another statistic added to the documentation. Another confirmation that would be filed and recorded and preserved, even as the military that had created those records collapsed toward defeat. The landscape of the Eastern Front in early 1945 had become a graveyard. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of death. Shattered equipment, burned out vehicles, craters from artillery impacts, and always the bodies. Some were buried hastily, many simply lay where they had fallen, frozen solid by the winter cold, preserved in whatever posture death had caught them. I had become part of this machinery of death, a component in the vast industrial process that the war had become. Each day I went out and killed enemy soldiers with professional efficiency. Each day the front line shifted slightly, positions changed hands, territory was won or lost. Each day the war continued, grinding forward toward its inevitable conclusion. The rifle had become an extension of my body, the scope an extension of my vision. I could estimate range instinctively, compensate for wind and temperature automatically, execute shots with mechanical precision. The training and experience had transformed me into an effective killing instrument, exactly what the military had intended when they selected soldiers for sniper training. But the human cost of this effectiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. The dreams grew worse. The faces multiplied. The moment of pulling the trigger replayed endlessly in the darkness. Sleep brought no rest, just a different kind of suffering.